of Macedon. We're into book 2, 6, Bridgehead. The crossing had been a jolly one. The weather had been perfect, with the breath of the north wind caressing the troubled waters of the strait, and a clear sun warming the reddish earth of the Asian side, and the hill of Ilium. Oh, Troy is called Ilium. Okay. Visible against the higher ridges of the land's backbone, only friendly gulls skimmed the water without a sign of enemy ships. Even the most superstitious of Greek allies conceded that the omens were good. The so-called gods most certainly favored the expedition in its crossing, and that was an indication of success to come. A whole flotilla of fishing smacks and merchant craft ferried back and forth across the gut of the Dardanelles, and men shouted hail as they waded ashore and turned to glance back at the familiar northern shore. Someone had thrown a garland of ivy over Alexander as he jumped ashore in his armor, with the white plumes on his shining helmet, and already they had set up marble blocks as altars to Zeus, the godfather. Of course, the whole father bit and all that doesn't have to be part of Zeus. Using the word Zeus, but protector of wayfarers, and also to Athena, to honor the Athenians with expedition. At these altars, they had poured libations out of gold cups, and they had hurried into a festive mood to the fallen towers of Ilium to look for the historic Scaean gates and hunt for souvenirs, amassed to discover how small was the hilltop upon which heroes had performed immortal deeds. Well, that's how legends go, right? Here the merchants and the fisherfolk, who still inhabited the hill, showed them relics. They stared at the dark shield and broken harp, where the temple attendees swore had been Achilles, and they took it to be a favorable omen when Alexandros, after inspecting the shield, kept it. Yeah, I should be saying Alexandros. Inspecting the shield, kept it to be carried with the army, and left his own in its place. The festival, in fact, became general that evening, when the leaders drank wine at the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus, the two mighty friends, until, feeling joyful, they twisted garlands in their hair and stripped off their clothes to dance in honor of these illustrious dead. Alexandros, when he tired of the dancing and flutes, sat in the torchlight, arguing with Hephaestion about whether Achilles had really been supreme among warriors, or whether he had been shaped by Homer's verses into a legend. Suppose that Homer had never written the Iliad. What then would they know of Achilles? Nothing, Hephaestion said. If a man did not have a mighty poet to make a song of his deeds, he would be forgotten after the last grandfather of the last grandson died. They weren't dancing and drinking here to the memory of Greeks and Trojans, but to the memory of what Homer had sung. But the lemma objected hotly that rhetoric could not make fame. Take a gorgeous woman like Helen. Why? He felt. Why could he feel the ghost of the long-haired Helen moving through the grove, passing with the night wind? Hephaestion snorted and said in that case he had better put on some clothes. The Macedonian Pizzeteri sipped a little over their wine. They felt the damp, dark earth with their fingers and looked at the numerous lambs and great flocks of sheep and agreed that this was good, fertile soil. Better than their own stony hill side. Better than their own stony hillsides. Although the Macedonians were disappointed by the small size and poverty of the ruins, they felt happy to be camped along the graves of the old heroes, especially Alexandros, who ordered the inhabitants to repair walls and promised them freedom in perpetuity from tribute payment. When he marched from Troy, it was to battle. Parmenio's spies had brought word that the strong forces of Asiatics were moving in from the east. This did not disturb the chief of staff, who had tricked the enemy by making a surprise crossing. Leisurely now, he moved on with the Macedonians, keeping to the lowland near the shining sea, with the white summits of Mount Ida and Olympus in Asia standing like beacons ahead of him, when scouts reported the enemy in sight of the Macedonians employed into twin columns, and arrived in their own good time at a rain-swollen river called the Granicus, and there had their first sight of the horsemen of Asia. While the columns advanced on the river, and his young commander studied the forces on the far bank curiously, the fine, rangy horses massed in regiments, and the riders strange in loose trousers and colored capes, with small shields and sheaths of javelins slung in at their hips. For these horsemen were down at the river's edge, laughing at the silent Macedonians and shouting insults. Unani, who pays you to come here? Are you women to wear kilts? Undisturbed by the clamor, Parmenio observed more cavalry, with bows farther back. Along the crest of a ridge, he saw a phalanx of close-packed spearmen, Greek mercenaries, the whole strength he estimated to be less than his own, and the order of battle to be childish. With the best armed horsemen, Persian chivalry, down in the valley at the edge of the turbulent stream, shouting challenges. Coldly he summed up the situation to the restive Alexandros, who was tense with anxiety. Don't listen to them, Parmenio warned, and don't try to move out across that water. It's treacherous and deep in places, and they could maneuver against us where they like. We would lose alignment and have to climb out of the water. What did you say? Alexandros was muttering. You didn't turn a hair at the Hellespont, and now you're afraid of this bastard of a stream. All you have to do, Parmenio went on, making no sense out of the mutter, is to do nothing. Hold the formations here, go into camp. They've only one good brigade of infantry, and they won't dare stay near us after dark. They're cavalry. They'll be gone in the morning, and you can cross as you will, without hurting a man. And what then? They'll be laughing at us still. This burst of temper seemed to the chief of staff as childish as the behavior of the Asiatics challenging veteran Macedonians into a cavalry skirmish in a river, as if it were a new game. But Alexander would not let the challenge pass. He ordered the skirmish line ahead of the columns, down into Granicus, and rode off to the companions on the right. He was not riding the black horse that day. Tense with excitement, he pushed through to Philotas and started the armored horsemen down the river into the river. Come, he called, leading his regiment down. Everything disastrous that Parmenio had predicted happened in the next hour. Alexander plunged into flood water up to his knees, turned instinctively down current toward the center of the massed Persian horse. Losing all formation among the rocks, the companions stumbled and plowed downstream, hard hit by flights of javelins, half blinded by spray, slipping in the mud, caught against rocks. They wheeled up the far bank and were met by the rush of horses handled with swift skill. Their long, light spears, with cornel wood shafts, snapped like glass. In this press of shields, rocks, and brush, horses fell and men crashed down. Their surviving companions pressed close to Alexander's white plumes and cloak yanked out of their short swords. The Persian leaders headed for the Macedonian chief, a javelin caught in a joint of Alexander's bronze chestplate, and his plumes were hacked off. He reached back to his weapon carrier for a fresh spear, and the man waved the shaft he held to show it was broken. A sword bit into Alexander's helmet, stunning him and driving the sight from his eyes. Crouching, he bent over his head and never saw Black Clytus, his bodyguard, covering him. A Persian chief in gleaming gold-washed armor struck at his bent head, but Clytus hacked the descending arm off at the joint and held a shield over Alexander. The Macedonian army kept their leader from going down in this mad press of bleeding horsemen. Cretan archers put up a covering discharge of arrows over the disordered companions, and Parmenio started the infantry phalanx across the stream in the confusion. These spearmen worked their way up to firm footing out of the mud. In a little, the Persian horse pulled away, and the action ceased at the river as abruptly as it had begun. Black Clytus wiped the sweat from his palms on his kilt and looked Alexander over. While you are still here, he said. Alexander could see clearly again and move all his limbs. He said nothing, retching under his helmet brim, while the companions gathered. Then he led them headlong up the slope at the solid square of the Greek mercenaries, who had not tried to retreat in the face of cavalry. The sunburned mercenaries stood their ground like figures of stone behind the hedge of spear points, and Alexandros's horse went down, killed by a spear, and he was thrown heavily, bruised, rolling helplessly on the ground. By the time he could mount again and hold a weapon, the surviving Greeks, 2,000 of them, had laid down their weapons and given themselves up. By then the swift Persian cavalry had passed out of sight into the hills, and the Macedonians had started searching the ground for weapons and valuables. The turbulent Granicus brawled through the valley, where men moved busily, making camp, carrying in the wounded and stacking the weapons. Alexandros had to recall with an effort that his horses had died, and he was riding a strange mount. Black Clytus had gone, and Philotas, unmarked, was speaking in cold, clipped words. Nearly 100 of the companions will have their graves here. Going down to the stream, Alexandros threw off the helmet and dipped his head in icy water. He felt shaken and suddenly hungry. With some officers, Parmenio came up as he was drying himself. The chief of staff, impassive, chose his words carefully. You took too great a risk, but you did well to angle into the river. It helped the man behind you. And then, curiously, did you know that the Greek mercenaries had asked for terms when they were left alone? Alexandros shook his head, muttering, they were Greeks hired against Greece. If you're surprised that Greeks will meet Greeks, then you will have much amazement in store for you. Many of the mercenaries, Parmenio explained, were Athenians. Only those who had hidden among the bodies of the dead had managed to escape. Their commander had been killed, with most of the noble-born Persians. For the searcher of the field had identified a son-in-law of the great king with an uncle and other relatives, a viceroy and governor of provinces, and many general officers. The commander of the Persian cavalry had committed suicide when the retreat began. It seemed strange to Alexandros that all this had happened, and that so many hours had passed in what he had thought to be no more than the rush of a few moments. Already dusk was hiding the river, and the sunset glow fading along the peaks. See, he doesn't know how to use the word. The sunset glow fades into dusk. That day had been a bloody business, Parmenia pointed out, holding in anger. Too many horsemen had died in this river. Alexandros himself had escaped twice, once by Clytus's quickness, and again by sheer luck. He had endangered the companions' cavalry, and risked defeat, which would have been a stunning blow to morale at the start of the expedition. But the men of the phalanx spoke otherwise. Among themselves, they had suffered less than the cavalry, and it seemed to them, as at Charonea, that Alexandros had led them in person to triumph, as if indeed he had in him the spirit of Alios, the so-called god of battles. After that, where Alexandros went, no man would refuse to go. With nightfall, reaction gripped Alexandros. He went from fire to fire, watching the physicians at work over the wounded men, asking the men how they had been hurt, and letting them brag of what they had done that day. He gave order that the companions should be buried fully armed, and that their families at home should be freed from harvest tithes and future service. In this emotional strain, he ordered the sculptor Lysippus to make memorial statues of some of the illustrious dead to be cast in bronze and placed about the altar pillar erected on the battlefield. The semblance of these men and the memory must survive. Afterwards, recovering from the black moodiness, he arranged for a shipment of spoil to be sent to Olympias and Antipater, and 300 suits of Asiatic armor to be presented to the Parthenon at Athens, with the inscription, Alexandros, son of Philip, and the Greeks, all except the Spartans, present at this offering, taken from the foreigners of Asia. So, at the same time, he sent money home and paid tribute to Greek patriotism, and he never repeated the mistake of that headlong rush into the river Granicus, for Alexander learned the lessons of command quickly. Much later, a hard-headed Roman historian, Arrian, pointed this out. He was quick to recognize what had to be done, while others were still held back by uncertainty. From observation of facts, he was most successful in conjecturing what was likely to happen. In danger, he relieved the fear of his men by his own freedom from fear. Thereafter, he did quickly and boldly what had to be done, even when he was uncertain of the result. What had to be done after the action at the Granicus was to move quickly, leaving a military commander at the bridgehead of the strait. The Macedonian army started south downward the coast of Asia, covering 20 miles a day. Its chief of staff was troubled by more than Alexander's recklessness. His intelligence had informed him that Memnon of Rhodes, a veteran commander of mercenaries, had escaped from the field of the Granicus. That same Memnon alone at the council, before the engagement, had argued that the Persian command should withdraw slowly before the Macedonians, avoiding battle and trampling down the crops, burning stocks of grain and emptying the villages of inhabitants, so that the invaders would find no fodder, food, or assistance on their way. They might then be led into the interior to be met there by a greater mobilization of Persian power and cut off from their base at the strait. At this was the line of action Parmenio most feared. Far inland and out of reach lay the main strength of the Asiatics. On the other hand, hostile fleets patrolled the coast and might either cut the Macedonian communications at Dardanelles or make a raid upon Greece, with or without Spartan assistance. And Parmenio heard that Memnon of Rhodes had gone out to these fleets. The Macedonians, barred from the sea and the interior, were marching down the winding coast against time.